Today's passage is from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Nehemiah 6, 1 through 13. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of the enemies that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to this point I had not set the doors on the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message. Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messages to them with this reply. I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to go down to see you? 4 times they sent the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Then the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter, in which it was written, "It is reported among the nation," and Geshem says it is true, "that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now, this report will get back to the king, so come, let us confer together." I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you're saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. One day, I went to the house of Nehemiah, son of Delilah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in his home. He said, "Let us meet in the house of God, inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you." But I said, "Should a man like me run away, or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go." I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. There was once a man who got into a taxi and told the taxi driver where to go. Rode along for a few minutes, and then the man realized he needed to make another stop. So he reached up and gently tapped the driver on the shoulder to get his attention. The driver screamed, lost control of the car, nearly hit a bus, careened on the sideway, hit the brake, and barely stopped, just inches from a huge plate glass window. The 2 men sat there for a moment, just catching their breath. Finally, the driver said, "I am so sorry. You scared the living daylights out of me." The pastor said, "No, I'm sorry. I didn't realize tapping you on the shoulder would scare you so much." The driver said, "It's all my fault. You see, today is my first day driving a cab. The last 25 years, I drove a hearse." Today we're going to continue the book of Nehemiah. And we're going to continue with the theme of the opposition that we face in our Christian lives. And today I want to talk about one of the most powerful weapons the enemy uses against us. That is fear. Now, I have mentioned in the past that the most common command in the Bible, it's not the command to have faith, it's not the command to love, that is a distant second. The most common command in the Bible is, do not be afraid. In the NIV, that phrase is found at least 70 times in the text of the Bible. Do not be afraid. And I can understand why. Fear is an issue we all deal with. And you know the most common mental disorder in America? I thought it would be depression. It's very common right now, but that's not it. And I thought perhaps a memory disorder like dementia or Alzheimer's. It's also not it. The most common mental disorder that's diagnosed in our country today is the phobia. It's the irrational or all-consuming fear that Americans deal with more than anything else. Yet today we have this command, do not be afraid. And it's not a suggestion. God did not say you don't have to be afraid if you don't want to be. It is a command. Do not be afraid. So, how do we get there? So today I want to look at the fear that Nehemiah faced and then talk about how we can overcome fear in our lives. We pick up the story in Nehemiah. The work on the city wall was almost complete. Nehemiah had closed all the gaps, and all he had left to do was hang the gates and do a few other minor repairs to finish the city wall. This means that the enemies of Nehemiah and of the Israelites, the Sanballat and the Samaritans, realized that this was their last chance. They didn't stop Nehemiah now, it'd be too late for them. Once the wall was complete, then Jerusalem was protected. It didn't really matter if Nehemiah was there or not. They also realized that they would not be able to intimidate Nehemiah to the point that he would just give up the work. Efforts to make Nehemiah feel anxious or afraid or overwhelmed to the point that he stopped working on the temple and the wall had just failed entirely. So they needed to take a more subtle approach. They wanted to try to scare Nehemiah to the point that they acted out of fear and he made a mistake. They tried this in two ways. First, they used legal pressure and social pressure to try to scare Nehemiah. They sent an open letter to Nehemiah. This is kind of the ancient world's version of a post on Facebook or a statement on Twitter. Sometimes amazing things people put on Facebook. Have people forgotten that this is the internet? That once you put it out there, it's there for everybody to see. You can't unsay it, you can't ever really delete it, and once you post it, even on a private account, you don't have control over who sees it anymore. It's written in ink for the world to see. Well, that's sort of what this open letter was from Sanballat. It was an effort to start a rumor. Sanballat sent this letter, and it was addressed to Nehemiah, but it was open for everyone to read. And Sanballat even used the classic line of any true gossip. I'm just telling you what I heard. Sanballat said, I'm telling you what I heard. It is reported among the nations that the reason you're building this wall is that you're going to rebel against King Artaxerxes and against the Persian Empire. So now, come, let's meet together and talk about this. This is the fifth time that Sanballat had tried to get Nehemiah to leave the security of Jerusalem to meet with him in an isolated place. And Nehemiah correctly recognized it's a trap. Sanballat was planning to kill him if he could just get him away from the rest of his guards. And so Nehemiah refused to take the bait. All right, this is not the first time Sanballat had tried this, but Sanballat was thinking now if he could get Nehemiah scared enough that Nehemiah would think this was his only option. Nehemiah didn't take the bait. He sent back a letter saying, I'm busy working, I don't have time to be with you. So Sanballat tried one more time to get Nehemiah to make a mistake out of fear. He sent a man named Shemaiah to talk to Nehemiah. And Shemaiah said that since Sanballat's last trick didn't work, now Sanballat was just sending assassins to kill Nehemiah. They were coming that night, and if Nehemiah wanted to survive the night, he needed to go into the temple, the holy place where only the priests were allowed, and lock the door. Otherwise, the assassins would kill him that night. I don't know if they were really assassins or not. But the goal here was to scare Nehemiah. He wanted to scare Nehemiah into making a decision based on fear and going into the temple where only the priests were allowed to go. And Nehemiah was not a priest. If Nehemiah, a political leader, did what was only allowed for the priests, that would be a sin against the Lord. This is the same sin that caused Israel's first king, Saul, to lose his throne. Sanballat didn't think he could get Nehemiah to stop working on the temple, But if Nehemiah went into the temple away from the west, where he was not allowed to go, then he would sin against the Lord. He would discredit his name, and his legacy would be permanently tainted. Now, once again, Nehemiah did not take the bait. He realized it would be wrong for him to do this, and he continued to work on the temple. He would not make a decision based on fear. That's what our God wants from us as well. But how do we get there? Well, for the rest of the sermon, I want to talk about 4 steps for how we can overcome fear in our lives. First step to overcoming fear is accepting it. And we need to accept that no matter how brave we are, no matter how faithful we are, there are times when we are afraid. Fear is not a sin. Fear is an emotion. Emotions aren't right or wrong. They just are. What matters is what we do with them. I think sometimes we put a special stigma on fear. We think it's not okay to be afraid. That if I were stronger, or if I were braver, or if I had more faith in God, that I'd never experience fear. But that's not reality. General George Patton led the Allied forces in World War II in Northern Africa. He was the embodiment of the tough as nails, not afraid of anything, man's man. On one occasion, he met with a local military leader. And this military leader praised Patton for his great courage, his bravery in battle. And according to one reporter, Patton said, "Sir, I'm not a brave man. I must confess to you that I am an utter craven coward. I have never in my life been within the sound of gunshot or battle and not been so scared that I felt sweat in the palms of my hands." Years later, when Patton wrote his autobiography, he wrote, "I determined early in life never to give counsel to my fears." Well, that's the first key. It's not pretending that we're never afraid. There will be times in life when we are stressed out, anxious, and afraid. And fear is not a sin. The key is not to never be afraid. The key is not to make decisions based on fear. And for us to do that, first we have to accept that at times we are afraid. So, first step to overcoming fear is to accept that we are afraid. Second step to overcoming fear is identifying our fear. If we're going to overcome fear, we need to recognize what it is that we are afraid of. We can't overcome our fear unless we identify our fear. Now, this can be difficult at times. We need to take that time to identify fear. Now, for Nehemiah, this was pretty straightforward. He was afraid for his physical safety. He was afraid that this rumor would get back to King Artaxerxes that he was starting a rebellion and Artaxerxes would become arrested. Or he was afraid that Sanballat would send assassins to kill him that night. That's a direct physical fear. And we do face that sometimes in life. There are times when we will experience fear for our physical safety. I think that's relatively rare. More often, it's a deeper kind of fear we need to deal with. It's a fear of change. We get used to the way things are, and we're afraid of any kind of change. It's a fear of the unknown. What is familiar is comforting, even if it's not necessarily good. And we become afraid of what we don't know or don't understand. It's a fear of rejection. We're afraid that if we are honest with other people, they will not accept us, and we're afraid of that rejection. It's a fear of failure. I think all of us have in us that voice that says, if you never try, you can't really fail. We face these fears in life. And if we're going to overcome these fears, we need to identify what it is we are afraid of. Now, in my experience, if we get to the point where we're willing to accept that we have a fear and are trying to identify it, the biggest challenge we face is recognizing what our fear is and not what it's supposed to be. Overcoming the idea of a socially acceptable fear. Let me give you an illustration of this. And this is kind of a lengthy illustration, so stay with me here. Don't zone out halfway through, you're going to miss the point. As I was researching this sermon, I came across an illustration that several people use. Different preachers and different commentators use this illustration. It's an interesting illustration about fear. I want to give it to you. In 1960, Johns Hopkins University did a study on the most common fears among young children. They found that among grade school students, the most common fears they face were heights, animals, strangers, the dark. 30 years later, they did another study looking at the most common fears among children. And they found the most common fears among children then were cancer, nuclear war, divorce, being mugged. Now that is a striking illustration. That says something about the nature of fear. Here's the catch. It's not true. That second study never happened. In fact, actual studies have repeatedly found that fears among children haven't changed in the years we've been studying. For all the years we've been studying fear, the most common fears among children have always been strangers, insects, or animals, and the dark. No one knows where that second list came from. Most likely, somewhere along the way, some well-meaning preacher thought these are the things kids should be afraid of. And so he replaced their actual fears with what he thought they ought to fear. I recognize that particular confusion might not affect most of it, but I think it illustrates a deeper point. There's an almost unconscious temptation to replace our real fears with what we think we ought to fear. There is a temptation to replace what we fear with what we think society says we should be afraid of. And when we do that, we make it far more likely that we will act out of fear because we're not identifying our genuine fears. If we are going to be able to overcome fear, we have to identify what it is we are afraid of, not what we think we're supposed to be afraid of. So, to overcome fear, we need to accept it, we need to identify it. Third, we focus on faith. I think a mistake people often make when dealing with fear is that we try to outthink fear. It's like we're trying to play chess with fear in our minds. Yeah, I am a massive nerd. I don't think anybody's surprised by the fact that I like the game chess. It is, to me, the greatest board game ever made. And the reason for that is that there are no surprises. There is no luck in chess. You know every move your opponent can make, and your opponent knows every move you can make. It's a game of pure skill and thought. Life is not like that. As much as we try, we can't see everything that's coming. We cannot control the future. We can make reasonable preparations for the future, but it is ultimately beyond our control. And if we try to outthink our fear, if we try to come up with every angle in every situation and outplay fear, we're really just feeding into fear. We are causing our fear to grow by focusing on our fear. Instead, we should focus on faith. I said earlier in this sermon that the most common command in the Bible is, do not be afraid. I want to add to that most of the time when God says do not be afraid, he also gives us a reason why we should not be afraid. In Exodus 14:13, God said, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance of your Lord. The Lord will bring you this today. In Deuteronomy 3:22, God said, do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God himself will fight for you. In Joshua 10:8, God said, do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not a one of them will be able to withstand. Luke 12:32, Jesus said, do not be afraid, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. We don't overcome fear by focusing on the fear itself. We overcome fear by focusing on why we do not need to be afraid in Jesus Christ. We do not need to be afraid because our God delivers us. We do not need to be afraid because our God stands with us. Our God fights for us. We do not need to be afraid because God is pleased to deliver us the kingdom. What do we have to be afraid of? When we focus on fear, our fear grows. When we focus on faith, our fear diminishes. So, to overcome fear, we accept it, we identify it, we focus on faith, and fourth and finally, we silence it. We silence fear in our lives. Now, this is not silencing common sense. This is not taking risks for no reason. That was one of the temptations Jesus faced. In the Gospels, the devil took Jesus up to a high building and said, if you're the Son of God, jump. What do you got to be afraid of? You know God will catch you. That was a temptation to false faith, to taking a risk for no reason. And that's not silencing. Rather, when we silence fear, when we've identified it, we've accepted that it's there, we're focusing on faith, and now we're making decisions that are not based on fear. I entitled this sermon, Silenzio, Bruno. I don't know if many people get that reference. It's from a recent Pixar movie called Luca. And in that movie, the title character is filled with doubt and anxiety. And he has a friend who says, when you hear those doubts and that fear, that's just Bruno talking. And he had named all his fears Bruno. And the main character said, why is he named Bruno? The friend said, it doesn't matter. He was just giving a name to his fears so that he could tell them to be silent. When we face anxiety, when we face fear, when we've accepted it, identified it, then we can say, Silenzio, bro, silence fear. So that we can make decisions not based on fear. There's an old story about a superstitious man who saw a black cat cross his path, and he was very anxious about this. He wondered what kind of bad luck this would bring him. And he talked to his friend about this fear and said, what do you think is going to happen to me because of this black cat? And his friend said, well, that depends. Are you a mouse? We need to know who we are. We need to know who we are in Jesus Christ. Because when we don't know who we are, then fear runs wild in our lives. When we know who we are in Jesus Christ, then perfect love drives out all fear. And we can say silence to our fears. It's not that fear is wrong. Fear is an emotion. Emotions aren't right or wrong. But we can silence our fears and choose not to act on them. We can make decisions without fear. So, we will face fear. It is a part of life. We can accept our fear, identify our fear, focus on faith, and then finally silence our fear. I have one last thought to close out today's sermon. I've talked about the most common command in the Bible, which is do not be afraid. And while that's the most common command in the Bible, that doesn't make it the most important command in the Bible. According to Jesus, the most important command in the Bible is the command to love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and with all your soul. And love your neighbor as yourself. That is the most important set of commands in the Bible. Now, sometimes that requires courage. That requires overcoming fear. Because loving God with all that we are and loving our neighbor as ourselves will involve risk and loss. And we need to overcome those fears. But courage without fear is meaningless. Or excuse me, courage, I said that wrong. Courage without love. Courage without love is meaningless. If we don't have love, courage is pointless. Because I could be brave, at least in theory. I could climb a mountain without a safety rope. I could tame a lion with a wooden chair and a whip I don't know how to use. I could run with scissors. I could do all kinds of things that require courage. But if I'm not doing them out of love for God or love for my neighbor, then I am at best a showboat and at worst an arrogant fool. Courage matters. But courage only matters when it is in service to love. Without love, courage is meaningless. In a moment we are going to stand for invitation. Now if we stand to sing, if fear has been running your life, you have been making your choices on fear instead of on the love of God, and you want to see a change. You have that opportunity. This week, talk to myself, talk to one of the elders. Or if you need to make your own commitment to Christ right now, to overcome fear, to live in His grace, you have that chance. I ask you to stand with me for an invitation hymn. It's Victory in Jesus, number 473. We'll sing all of this.